Darrin is the National Farmer Union's Director of Climate Crisis Policy and Action. In his recent work with the NFU, Darrin is the author of several reports, including Tackling the Farm Crisis and the Climate Crisis, a transformative strategy for Canadian farms and food systems, from 2019. Imagine If, a vision of near zero emission farm and food system for Canada, in 2021. And Nitrogen Fertilizer, critical nutrient, key farm input, and major environmental problem, in 2022. In addition to his current position, he has served on other roles with the NFU between 1996 and 2010, including Director of Research. He has been active in supporting many NFU campaigns, including genetically modified wheat, the struggle to retain the Canadian Wheat Board, and has worked to keep the genetically modified hormone RBGH out of the Canadian dairy supply. He is also the author of the 2019 book, Civilization Critical: Energy, Food, Nature, and the Future, which has recently been translated and released in China. He farmed with his family for 2 decades just south of Saskatoon. He has academic degrees in history, biology, and political studies. So Darrin, welcome to the podium.
Thank you very much, Cam, and thanks to all of you. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak here today. So in the interest of time, I'll just get started. Really also want to thank Sam and Tamara for all their comments. There's going to be a little bit of overlap, but that's a good thing, a very positive thing. So I'm going to talk about economic growth and agriculture and the delegitimation and denormalization of growth. My talk has 4 parts, so I'm just going to launch in. I am going to argue in the first part that we have a very large civilizational problem and that agriculture is really enmeshed in that problem. So this is a graph of the last 2,022 years of the global economy. The units are trillions of dollars, but that doesn't matter. What really matters is the shape of that graph. So it starts in 1 CE, otherwise known as 1 AD, and goes all the way to the present. And you see the incredible takeoff during the 20th century. I've highlighted 1900 and 2000. That's a 16-fold increase during the 20th century. But worse than that, we're on track for a 16-fold increase during the 21st century. And a 16-fold increase is the product simply of what we think of as normal rates of economic growth. 2, 2.5, 3% per year economic growth gives you a doubling time of 25 years. If you double every 25 years, you get 4 doublings per century. It goes 2, 4, 8, 16. We are on track for a 16-fold increase in the size of the global economy during the 21st century, just as we had that same multiplication in the size of the global economy during the 20th. So I'll just overlay onto that a set of tan triangles. That's energy use, billions of barrels of oil equivalent. Not surprising, the two track each other. To make the economy bigger, it requires more energy, and a bigger economy with richer people demands more energy for production, consumption, transport, heating larger houses, jet vacations, etc. Not surprising, if energy use is going up, so too are emissions. Those brown circles are emissions, hundreds of millions of tons of carbon per year. And this is what I mean, we've made a civilizational error. We have set out on a path that is completely, wholly, structurally, fundamentally, clearly, inescapably unsustainable. What's happening now is that the growth is occurring at the expense of nature. We're consuming nature, we're consuming the biosphere, we're consuming the things upon which our future depends. The global economy is growing, but the rainforests are shrinking, the ecosystems and the biosphere are being damaged. We're counting the growth in dollar terms, but we're not counting the destruction and the consumption. I can log in on my device and find the price of any given stock in the world to a very detailed degree, but there's very, very little data on the destruction of the environment. Greta Thunberg put this very well, and she was talking at the UN in 2019, and she talked about fairy tales of eternal economic growth. I think that's best case scenario, fairy tales. I think worst case scenarios, these are a bit nightmarish if you sort of think your way through to where they might lead us. I wonder if I missed a slide. Anyway, I did. I'm going to argue that we need to delegitimate growth. We need to denormalize it. We need to take away from it its patina of positivity and expose growth as what it really is. More than that, I'm going to argue that limits are a form of wisdom. And that's really the key here. Limits are a form of wisdom. Limits are what can keep us from coming to a very bad end for this civilization and this global economy. And I just want to pick up on something that Sam said. He talked about equitably downscaling the economy. And I think that's really clear. I don't think we need to stop growth everywhere. I don't think we need degrowth everywhere, but we need it in many, many places, in lower income nations and lower income households. We need degrowth in some places that in lower income nations and lower income households. We can have growth and more equitable distribution. And we need degrowth in things like automobile production so we can make room for growth in things like electric transit buses, for instance, or solar panels and wind turbines. So I want to switch to agriculture and make the case that agriculture, as we're currently practicing it, is, like the larger economy in which it's embedded, the larger capitalist economy, highly growth addicted. This is a graph over the last 70-some years, 1950 to present, of world production of total grains and oilseeds, total grains. It excludes oilseeds, but if oilseeds were in there, it would look more or less the same. And you can see the 3- or 4-fold multiplication in global output. This is Canadian data over a longer period of time, 1908 to present, so it's at 114 years. Approximately 7-fold increase in the output of major grains in Canada, and the slope of the trend line is getting steeper. It's an exponential growth. And just to give you a sense of how fast and how far this is growing, you can see on the right-hand side that low point, that was 2021, that was the drought. The crop in much of the prairies was dramatically reduced, but note how that dramatically reduced crop was still bigger than just about any crop before the year 2000. The smallest crops in recent years are bigger than the largest crops in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and most of the 2000s. It's not just crop output, it's livestock. This is a graph of global chicken production over 100 years. Starts in 1950, goes to the current, and then is projected forward to 2050. You've got about a 20-fold increase in the tonnage there, with another doubling projected by mid-century and probably a couple more doublings between mid-century and the end of the century. And it's not just that we're producing more birds. This is a picture from a journal article, and just look at that bottom row. You probably can't read it from where you are, so I'll just help you understand what you're seeing there. That bottom row of 3 birds those are 56-day-old chickens, not even 2 months, 56-day-old chickens. The one on the left is a 1950s commercial broiler. In the middle is 1970s, and on the right is what they look like today. We've literally made our livestock animals monstrous in proportion. The one on the left at 56 days is about 1 kilo, the one in the middle is 2 kilos, and the one on the right is 4 kilos, doubling and redoubling the size of those animals. Canada is part of this global move to increase chicken meat. This is a graph from the 1960s to today of the tonnage of chickens produced in Canada. Time doesn't permit, but we could do similar graphs around pork production. Cattle are a little more moderate, but in general, this production's increasing and increasing. I'll just say one thing about chickens. The global chicken production and the number of chickens has now reached such a point that if you added up the weight of every chicken on Earth, and if you added up the weight of every wild bird, every goose and duck and hummingbird and pigeon and parakeet, the chickens outweigh the wild birds 2-to-1. So what does this all mean in the big picture? This is the graph that I think about the most. I think it's one of the most important pictures of what we're doing on this planet. It's the one that keeps me awake at night sometimes. 3 time periods are shown in this graph. On the left is 50,000 years ago, in the middle is 11,000 years ago, and on the right is today. These stacked bar graphs show 3 things: the mass, the biomass in tons of wild animals, of livestock animals, and human animals. And so on the left, you see 50,000 years ago, it's one brown bar, a world dominated by wild animals. If you really, really got in close and squinted, you'd see a tiny little sliver of blue at the bottom representing the humans, but there really wasn't many. So it really was a world dominated by wild animals. In the middle, 11,000 years ago, the dawn of agriculture, you see it's still a world dominated by wild animals, but there's many fewer because there was human predation and hunting, but also because that was a period when the northern hemisphere and part of the southern hemisphere were coming out of ice ages, so there'd been a reduction in the number. But look at where we are today on the right. You still see at the bottom the brown band, the wild animals, but it's much, much, much smaller. And then that huge band of tan color, that's our livestock. And then the blue on top is the mass, the tonnage of humans on the planet. And you can see 2 things. One, there just aren't many wild animals left and the trend line looks bad. But 2, overall, there's a lot more animals on the planet, way more than at any period, an unprecedented tonnage of biomass of animals. And one of the reasons is just the incredible amount of energy that we're turning into fertilizer, and fertilizer that we're turning into grain, and grain that we're turning into food supplies for livestock and humans. This is a graph of Canadian fertilizer tonnage, 122 years of data, 1900 to present, and you can see how it doubles and redoubles, and it's going up so fast that we have nearly doubled the tonnage of fertilizer just since 2006, and it's that kind of increase in Canada and around the world that supports the kind of picture that we see here. That fertilizer in that graph I just showed you is produced from natural gas, and natural gas, fossil fuel, there's a lot of emissions, and this is a graph of Canadian agricultural greenhouse gas emissions. A lot of detail there, about 40 categories of emissions and soil carbon exchanges, but I'll just point out 2 things. One, the top line is going up about 30% since 1990, and the reason it's going up isn't because farmers are using more fuel or because cattle and other livestock and manure are producing more emissions. It's because of those green bands in the middle getting wider and wider, and those green bands in the middle are nitrogen fertilizer production and use. It's not just fertilizer. All the inputs into the system are increasing so that we push more inputs in so we can push more food out. This is a graph showing various countries' increases in insecticide and herbicide use. In the middle, you've got Canada. The period is 1990 to 2010, and during that 20-year period, insecticide use doubled and herbicide use nearly tripled, and it's only gone up since then. We could spend a whole 20 or 30 minutes talking about why all of this is happening, but I'll just take one slide and point out one thing. This is a graph that we did for the nitrogen report where we graphed agri-food exports from Canada and nitrogen fertilizer use. And some of you may know the federal government has a very, very single-minded focus on pushing up agri-food exports. When agri-food exports were 20 billion, they brought out a target to get to 40. When they're 40, it was going to be 50 and then 60, and recently we passed their target of 75, and now they've got a new target up in the 90s. So the federal government's got a prime directive, and that is agricultural exports must rise. But along with those agricultural exports rising, fertilizer use is also rising, and the correlation is quite tight. It's so tight that when I first did this graph, I just assumed that I'd graphed the wrong data because I didn't expect the correlation to be that tight. And, you know, we can dispute correlation versus causation and what's causing what, but one way to tell this story is a focus on a federal government policy focus on ever-increasing agri-food exports leads to a focus on ever-increasing yield and production, which leads to a focus on ever-increasing input use, including fertilizers. That's one of the drivers. I just want to talk a little bit about what's coming out. We've talked a lot about the fertilizer and energy going in, and now I want to talk about what's coming out because it's important to understand what we do with the output in order to make good decisions about whether we have to keep increasing production, whether we can or cannot get off of this production maximization treadmill. So just one slide in this part. We are maximizing the energy flow in, we're maximizing the input flow in, the fertilizer flow, and that leads us to maximize production and yield. But then we couple that to a maximization of waste and dissipation. And Tamara talked a lot about food waste. In Canada, it's estimated it could be as high as 30 or 40%. So we throw a large amount of our food into landfills, into the garbage and into landfills. And then we turn another big chunk into nutritionally disfigured junk food, tater tots and cheese doodles and Coca-Cola and Pop-Tarts. That's what I grew up when I was in university. I think that was my diet. Then we turn a whole bunch more into biofuels, and we put that into single occupant vehicles, which are commuting back and forth, often needlessly and wastefully. We feed a lot of high quality grain to livestock. There's nothing wrong with feeding damaged grain, maybe frost damaged wheat or barley or something to livestock, but that's not largely what we do. A lot of what we do is we feed top quality, purposely grown grain to livestock. And for every 5 to 10 calories or 5 to 10 units of protein that you put into that system, grain into livestock, you get 1 calorie or 1 unit of protein in. So those systems run at 80 to 90% losses. And then we do other things like we fertilize acres to grow cotton for fast fashion that we market on the internet and that people buy cheaply and wear once or twice and then discard. So the reason I bring this up is that the growth addiction, the input and output treadmill that farmers are running on in Canada isn't something that's needed. It's not needed to feed the hungry, feed the world. In fact, the opposite is true. It's a maximum production system that then turns around and wastes and dissipates much of the output. So we can, in fact, move to systems where we produce and consume less. I'll just end, but with a few observations on what we might do instead. So we need to start by acknowledging that we've created the least efficient, highest emission food system in the world, the least efficient, highest emission food system in history, and that we're coupling maximum inputs and maximum energy use to maximum waste and dissipation, and that we're growth addicted, and we've moved far beyond planetary boundaries in terms of movements of carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, water, etc. And that reforming this isn't going to be easy. We need a government-led mobilization for system-wide transformation, and best management practices and technological tweaks and incremental changes just aren't going to get us to where we need to go. Key to getting to where we need to go, and I think this is where the Farmers Union is very, very good. We're talking about real sustainability, we're talking about agroecology, we're talking about food sovereignty. We need to really change and diversify our goals. We need to move away from What in Canada often comes down to a focus on agri-food export maximization and production maximization. And we need a broader range of goals. Things like input optimization, use precious fertilizers very carefully and in smaller quantities. We need to minimize and then eliminate fossil fuels in the system so that we can reduce emissions. We need to really minimize waste. We need to use the output from the system much more rationally and carefully. And we need to look at reducing production and consumption in agriculture. And I just want to stress that last part. We need to consider how we can reduce production and consumption in the system. Because we can't double and redouble the inputs and outputs again. We can't double fertilizer use again moving forward. We can't double livestock numbers. So it's clear that this doubling and redoubling, this input use and output and yield maximization treadmill is going to have to come to an end. And that means we need to create a new agriculture, one where farm families can survive and thrive without pursuing endless growth in yield and output. We need to come to a more steady state, something that's much more sustainable. As Cam mentioned, there's a number of NFU reports, and I think they now total about 300 pages, and there's hundreds and hundreds of footnotes to peer-reviewed journal articles. So it's a real resource for getting more details on this. And Cam also mentioned my book, which takes a big picture look at a lot of these same issues. So thank you very much. Thanks, Cam.
Well, thank you, Darrin.